Okay, it's now September 4th, and this thing isn't in the air. I blame the fact that I actually did have to go to work, and there were some distractions from working on the plane for about 2.5 weeks, but we're back on track. So one of the things I had to do while I was gone is I went up to Alaska to go on a gold exploration drilling program, and then I went to Atlanta and also Miami briefly to go to a conference. So those two things have set me back at least 2.5 weeks. Nonetheless, we're back on track. It's been a month, so there's a lot to catch up on. So some of the things that I did get done before I left were a taxi test. We were able to get this thing out into the yard here and drive it around, which was a really exciting experience for me. It made the plane come to life because it was a real drivable vehicle. It's a car right now, but it's a car with wings. Not quite a flying car. The other things that I finished were flaperons are painted and rigged, as are wingtips, cowlings, all the hard surfaces basically have their Aerothane coats on them. We put all the rest of the glass on, so windshields, doors, turtle deck, and quarter windows. We'll talk about how that process went, as well as the finished paint, so some notes on finishing the paint, as well as the end numbers, and just a few gotchas along the way with the final install that I'd like to go over. A couple other things I wanted to talk about were sort of my experience in Alaska while I was gone, as well as some cool things about the trip to the conference in Atlanta and my sort of visit with Lauren, who built the Kitfox up in Alaska, the red Kitfox with the, I think it's an 0320, I always mix this up, but the 0320 engine. And I actually did get to fly in his plane up in Connect, which was a really awesome experience, and I'm really grateful that I had that time and opportunity, and Lauren was nice enough to let me go for a rip in his plane. So that being said, we'll start from the back of the plane and move forward talking about the things that I've finished before I left. The rudder is the first thing we're going to talk about today. I had some issues getting it finally installed. Because I have the Speedster tail, which is, the rudder is an airfoil shape, as is the actual tail. Normally it's just sort of a flat surface, just like it would be on a normal plane, but they have this airfoil, which is this fiberglass fairing that goes on top. So if it was a normal fairing, you'd be able to get in here on the mount bolts pretty easily. But now you have this big fiberglass fairing here that you have to cut holes in to access the mount bolts. So prior to covering, I had put the bolts in, but never put the nuts on. So I never really thought about how I was going to get a wrench in there after it was covered and make sure that I could tighten it. So when final install came, I tried to get those nuts on, and it was a huge pain. There was no way I could do it with the currently cut holes. So I ended up having to enlarge and slot some of my cutouts in this rudder to access it to get a nut onto the bottom. And even then, it was still pretty hard. But I did, it's a little sloppy to cut through the fiberglass with fabric on top of it, but I did it without a problem, and I'll just go through and sort of sand this up later and make sure it looks much cleaner. But had I known better, I would have put a check nut on the bottom of the bolt on the rudder prior to covering it or doing the final install, and made sure that I could access it. Because there's another problem, which is there's pieces of wood, there's wood ribs in here that also made it impossible to access that nut. So I ended up clipping some of the wood from outside the rudder, which wasn't ideal, but ended up getting it done. So basically the moral of the story is just test the fit with a nut and bolt and washers prior to covering it, and make sure that it fits right on the tail before you ever cover it with this fairing. If you don't have a Speedster tail, it doesn't really matter. So the other thing back here that we, of course, got finished is the steering springs and rudder tail wheel attachment are all on, and there wasn't much for instruction on how to do that. I actually asked Lauren how to do it, and he sent me a picture. So here's a picture of mine and how I did it. I didn't end up having to enlarge the holes on the bottom of the rudder, but I did that, and now it's all clipped on and ready to go, and it steers great because we did take it for a taxi. Moving on. All right, for those of you who are wondering why my channel is called 7 Kilo Fox, this is why. Some people have made this revelation for the first time in the last week because these are finally on the plane. But of course, KF is for Kitfox, and 7 is, if for those of you who don't fly, typically when you call on air traffic control, you use the last 3 letters or last 3 characters of your tail number. So the other plane I fly is 761 Papa Yankee, so it's 1 Papa Yankee. And this one would be 7 Kilo Fox, which is me. That's my birthday, and that's Kitfox. So there is some significance to it. I didn't reserve this. I think I reserved this tail number maybe 2 years ago. So it was really exciting for me to put it on. These are 12-inch numbers. I've talked about this. I did actually further research into whether or not you actually need 12-inch numbers. Mexico will not let you in. Actually, a lot of countries won't. Canada apparently doesn't care that much. I don't think you can get away with the 3-inch letters. I think you have to have 6-inch, but I just put in the 12-inch on, and you know, some people were like, wow, they're so big, but whatever. At least you know which one I am. I had a hard time doing this. I bought a stencil from Aircraft Spruce. It took them like 5 weeks to actually get me the stencil, so I wasn't very happy about that. Fortunately, I ordered it a long time ago, so I had it here and ready. It was a vinyl stencil, which should have raised some red flags for me. I put it on, left it overnight, painted it the next day, left it overnight, then pulled it off the next day, and I ran into some serious problems. The residue, I guess the vinyl paint, because I just painted it on with polyfiber paint. The vinyl paint dissolved the vinyl stencil and left a residue everywhere in between all the numbers. And I panicked. I just thought I was gonna have to repaint my entire plane. I tried everything I could possibly imagine to remove it, but nothing came off. And there was just ugly residue all over the place. So I talked to the guy who's been helping me paint, CL, who's a professional painter, and he gave me something called Prep-All, which pulled off that residue, no problem, and didn't affect the paint itself. And ended up spending probably 30 minutes aside cleaning up all the residue, and it looked fine. So the moral of the story is either A, you can just buy vinyl numbers that you stick on, and then they'll stay for I think up to 3 years. And that's a piece of cake. You don't have to paint anything, you just buy them and put them on. Probably should have done that to start with. If, however, you do a stencil, either, like if I were to do this again, I'd either pull it off immediately after I paint it. I'd wait for the polyfiber paint to dry, and then I'd pull it off immediately so it left no residue. Or I would have found a different stencil that used a different adhesive, sort of like a paper-based adhesive rather than a vinyl-based system, so that I didn't have issues with the paint. That added, of course, like 2 days of work just in cleaning it up, but I'm glad it's done, and there it is. So end numbers are finished. Moving further along onto the turtle deck. For those of you who don't know, this is the turtle deck. It's a big polycarbonate formed piece that covers the back section of this aircraft. The previous versions of Kitfox had a fiberglass piece with some glass strips in them, some polycarb strips in them. But since then they have this pre-molded piece that's really nice. I got the smoked version, so it's a little bit tinted. Not the easiest thing to put on, didn't take forever, but Brian Bowen does have a good video. This is Project Kitfox that we could put a link to of his process that he went through doing it. I basically just followed his and ended up having to kind of wing it here and there. The general gist of it is that you have to cut these cutouts for the carry-through spar up in the top so that it gets up next to the wing. And then you do the cutouts for the Flaperon, I don't know what you call these spars that come all the way into the plane, and then drill the holes so that you can mount it with cam locks. So on this note, I had talked about in the beginning whether or not I was going to do a hinged turtle deck. If you put a hinge back here, it turns your back into no longer a continuous glass surface because you have a hinge that goes across. So I was going to leave it because I like the idea of having just like a sort of full glass extension from the front to the back. However, when I was in Alaska, I saw Lauren's plane and he talked about how difficult it is to get to the back of this baggage compartment, because the baggage compartment is right here, without having a hinge. You have to completely either somehow crawl in from the front or take this whole turtle deck off, which if you can see the video of me putting it on, it's really hard to take on and off because there are, I think, 11 different cam locks that you have to undo. With the hinge, there are 7 cam locks on the back and you can just sort of lift it up from right here and you don't have to go through the whole removal process. It's a piece of cake. That being said, the provided cam locks from Kitfox are aluminum screw cam locks, so they have an actual Phillips head screw that allows you to just put it in with a screwdriver. So that means to remove them, you also need a screwdriver. I went ahead and bought winged cam locks. These are titanium from Skyvolt, which is in Leesburg. It's not that far from me. And I bought 7 of them for the back section so that I can easily, without a screwdriver, just pop the turtle deck on the back off, lift it up, and get into the baggage compartment pretty easily. So I have 7 of these plus 1 for the oil door up in the front, so they don't need a screwdriver to do any of this removal. when I'm out and about. And that's it for the turtle deck. This is actually good to fly right now. I could actually just pull the polycarb off, but I decided I wanted to put the hinge on, which I don't need to fly. I could do it later, but I'm just gonna do it now and call it good. There also is a strake that goes from right up to at the top of the windshield all the way back, and that actually covers these slots back here so you don't get leaking when the plane is in the rain. Again, not necessarily required for flight, but it does keep water out, so if it were gonna be in the rain, it would be something that I'd wanna have on there. So a little note on the baggage compartment. I didn't put this baggage compartment in until after covering for our final assembly, which there was some debate in the manual whether or not I should actually do that. I regret that. It would have been way easier to put it in before cover and then, look, a bug, then sort of cover it off, or like, I don't know, put saran wrap on it or something, and then I wouldn't have to put these floorboard screws in it, because it took me like 4 hours to get these floorboard screws in with another person, and my baggage compartment as a result is a little bit crooked because I can't adjust it now. It's very difficult to get down there. But nonetheless, something I wish I would have done, and if I had to do it again, I would do it that way. Okay. Another note while I'm back here, these cam locks, I learned something from Lauren when I was in Alaska. They have a little brass pin in the back that you can pull out, and what you're supposed to do is set the depth. So you adjust the depth on the cam lock so that it's tight and it's just the right depth that you want, and then you can pull that pin out and the cam lock sort of barrel inside will stay in place and it won't move. And that allows it to be a quarter turn fastener, and I still have to go through and set the depths on all these and then pull my pins and get them exactly right. So that's kind of one of the last steps that I didn't know about. While I'm back here, I guess I can talk about my quarter windows. I did these a long time ago and just pulled them out of storage, pulled the covering off of them and installed them. I installed them by using VHB tape and rivets, so I went overkill and did both. I still might run a bead of silicone, clear silicone along the edge to seal it off from water, but I feel pretty good about them. One thing I missed from the manual that I should have done was oversizing the holes in the plexiglass or the polycarbonate sheet to allow expansion and contraction for temperature changes. Should be okay, I'm not too worried. Whoops. As I said before the compressor interrupted me, it should be okay. I'm not worried about the expansion and contraction too much, but if it is a problem, that polycarb is really cheap to get from, I think, Lowe's. You can go get some, and I'll just cut a new piece, drill some holes, and put new ones in there. That's it for back here. I'm gonna move on and talk about the flaperons and the rigging of these bad boys, because they're done. So flaperons are finally finished and rigged. I did end up deciding to put striping on them for the paint. I finally finished the paint first of all and then put the stripes on. I was debating that. This is Aerothane paint, which I'll talk about paint briefly. I had a really hard time color matching the silver for Aerothane to the silver in polyfiber. The polytone silver kind of has a weird sheen to it, and depending on what angle you look at it, it changes color. The Aerothane is glossier, and if you put flattener in it, it kind of cuts some of the sheen. So I had a lot of trial and error to try and get the right amount of flattener to match the flatness, but also try and maintain that sheen look, and it's kind of fruitless. You can't really get them exactly the same. I feel like the only way to truly match the silver is to use polytone for both, but then again, polytone doesn't stick very well on this stuff, and you'd have to repaint it in pretty short order. So either way, the paint's done on these. A lot of people have made recommendations that I use 3M fine line tape. I did actually get some and have used the 3M fine line tape. Way easier than the other system that I was using, and made it super easy to put these stripes on here and the cowlings. That being said, once I got these painted, I've mounted them up and put them in the brackets, which was way easier to mount now because I had enlarged them from the last time because these brackets are kind of janky. Then once I got them in the brackets, I was able to put the final horn in and mount that in with my little wooden blocks, which I will grab. So these little wooden blocks go onto the flaperon there, they clamp onto it, and this is a wooden spacer. And I used a big level to put these in the right position and then set all the angles on the push rods in the cockpit and got the rig correct initially. Now, one thing I could never get properly rigged is the exact angles that they designate in the manual. There are definitely some errors in the rigging instructions in the manual. First things first, the horns on the, I guess the Flaperon mixer, whatever they call that part, are backwards. So the angles are reversed from right to left, and I didn't figure that out until I looked pretty closely at it and eventually figured it out. So that was one thing. And then another thing is that the angles are almost impossible to obtain from a maximum and minimum perspective. So you have a lot more motion than they designate in the manual. You have a lot more control available. And I tried to use the stop screws that they provided to get the angles exactly right, but it's really fruitless. So I did talk to Lauren about this, and he had spoken to John, and John said, don't get too worked up about the rigging as long as they're equal with each other, and you have at least that amount, like minimum amount of deflection, then you'll be okay. Over controlling it isn't really an option because the wind resistance gets so big that it's not really a problem. So that's what I've been told. I'm not 100% positive that's the case, but I'm not going to worry about any more sort of exactitude to the rigging numbers. I will be getting longer stop screws for the Flaperon, or the aileron function of the Flaperons, because there's definitely way too much motion in there. The deflection is just too extreme. So I'm gonna get longer stop screws, and that'll help me control my maximum and minimum and get me closer to the recommended rigging angles. That's pretty much it for the Flaperons. I just lubed them, and as soon as I lubed them, they became very smooth. I mean, almost paper light. But these are ready to go, and I could fly the plane if I wanted to, given the current rig. So this is a stall fence, which goes on top of the wing right here. And I had painted these in preparation to install them permanently because it was sort of an easy thing to get done, until I realized, fortunately I went to try and go fold the wings with flaperons on. And when you do that, you actually have to lift these flaperons all the way up. And the length of the stall fence is too long, so you can't fold the wing with the stall fence on. You'd have to trim it. So I went and trimmed the back end of this so that it's short enough to fold the wings. And now I'm gonna have to go back and either revarnish and repaint, or I'm not really sure what I'm gonna do here, but I've decided to just postpone putting on stall fences for the meantime, because there was that sort of error in the manual. They forgot to account for this whole adjustment in the folding instructions. So that's one little gotcha that I would have done differently had I known differently. That's it for that. Okay, a long time ago, I was having some woes about this tow transport kit, and I thought that I had solved it. I tried to put them on recently and realized there still are problems. So before you can even use it, you have to figure out where the flaperons are gonna be, and the wings and stuff have to be installed. So I couldn't really have figured it out until now. And what I've determined is that this was made for the smaller standard wing, which is, I think, 2 inches, has a 2-inch shorter chord than the STI wing. So if you have an STI wing, you have to basically extend these 2 inches. So the way I did that is I actually took it to a friend of mine who does some fabrication, and he cut them in half and welded a tube that allowed these to slide inside so that I could extend it to the right distance. And then I just added a mount, just like the front spar mount. I added a bolt that holds it from basically sliding in and out. So now that is the correct length for the STI wing, and I can actually transport this. Now, I'm gonna have to go through and powder coat it and probably sandblast and powder coat it, but for now, I'm gonna actually transport the plane with this stuff, and I needed this before I was gonna feel comfortable shipping it on the highway. Now, this is the front one. It worked just fine out of the box. You just have to sort of set the length for the spar, and the instructions are reasonably good. When I actually go to ship this thing, I'll have a good coverage on how this works, but definitely added a little extra cost and time to the whole operation to get these fabricated custom for the STI wing. Upholstery's all finished for this plane. We've got everything upholstered that needs to be upholstered. Glare shield, seat pan, the side panels, the center console, and I actually have the carpeting in on top of the floorboards. So we're good to go in terms of upholstery, and it looks really good. I was worried because the first time I tried to lay the upholstery down, it just was a complete like mess. And then I actually took it to a pro, and it was worth the whatever couple $100 that I spent to have a pro who has the right equipment and tools and adhesive and prep procedure, and he got it laid down really nice and smooth, and I'm glad that I went through that process because I was just struggling with it. After I got all this stuff in, what I did is I came in here and tried to clean up the loose ends on the cockpit. So I ended up putting anti-chafe tape on my hoses so that they're not rubbing the bottom of the fabric, as well as put strategically located grip lock ties to clean things up. I had to center all my cable routing down the middle of the center console because it was running into the little wheels for the adjustable rudder pedals, and so I got that out of the way and zip tied down, and then of course put carpeting in. One issue that I've talked about, and it's not just me, lots of people have talked about, is the control sticks are really close to the panel, and when you put the grip, stick grips on, or stiff grips, whatever they're called, that Brian Bowen makes or Project Kitfox makes, it ends up making them probably about an inch longer, and you basically are contacting the panel every time you go full stick forward. So what I did is I actually made mini stiff grips. I cut them down, so I just cut the foam in half and then put another slot in the plastic that was in there so that they're just little mini stick grips, and I actually then was able to cut down cut 2 centimeters off the aluminum on the control stick, and that was plenty to give me enough room for full maneuverability in the cockpit. What I'm going to do now is, now that this is done, it's still pretty close to the aft section for full back stick, so I can now rig about 2 degrees back forward so that I'm close enough to the cockpit to not cause, or far enough away from the panel so I'm not causing problems, and I'm also not rubbing on my seat, so I'm able to accomplish my ideal stick position now. Getting the actual push button push to talks in the top of the stick was really hard. I tried to wire it through the bottom of the stick, and it ended up rubbing lots of places. So I had talked about in a previous video a long time ago, this would have been last year I guess, about how I drilled 2 holes accidentally because the first time I mounted my sticks, it was crooked. So I had to drill a second hole to mount them straight. I ended up needing that second hole anyway to run my push-to-talk cable through, because that's the best way to get it, is basically running it through the bottom and all the way up to the stick grip. So I'm actually glad that I put that second hole in there because I would have had to drill one anyway. Let's see, is there anything else in this cockpit that I need to talk about? No, I did end up coming through here and again zip tying everything that needed to be zip tied, putting anti-chafing tape where things needed anti-chafing tape, touching up the upholstery, putting in floorboards, things like that, and then of course getting this glare shield in and tightened down. But yeah, this end of the plane I feel good about, and the electronics and everything are up and running without a problem. One of the things I wanted to talk about was my first taxi test, something I was super excited about. I was waiting to get brakes done, and then of course my rudders attached so that I had tailwheel steering to go taxi. We got that done, and I was able to take this thing for a cruise with a bunch of my buddies out in front of the barn here. And it was just as magical as I had imagined. The plane taxi's great. The suspension eats up everything. You can't even feel any of the bumps that are out there. It's not the roughest yard, but it's definitely not, like a paved driveway. If you come in with a small car, it definitely beats you up. But this thing just eats up all the bumps with the big squishy tires and big suspension. Really easy to whip around on the ground, and I didn't have a problem with forward visibility as much. I'd just been flying a Stearman not long ago, and this has great visibility compared to the Stearman. And worst case scenario, you can just pop the window open and lean your head out to the side and do an Ace Ventura and just sort of have the wind blowing in your face. But taxi test was sweet. We can put up some sweet shots of that. And I just was really happy. Before we did all that, we actually pulled all the covering off the glass pieces, and that was sort of the moment when I looked at it and you could see the plane. It was a complete aircraft, and it looks like a complete aircraft. Lights, camera, action, everything worked. So I thought I would be over at the airport by now, but of course I went to Alaska, and I'll talk briefly about what I was doing up there. So actually, prior to me going to Alaska, I went to a conference in Atlanta. It was a UAV conference. Some of the work that I do is related to drones, so went there to go meet some people and do some work. I flew down to Miami to pick up one of my contractors and flew up to Peachtree DeKalb Airport. It was a beautiful flight into Miami executive, awesome sunsets, and it's just always fun. I always prefer to go straight out to the coast and stay about 500 feet off the deck, and you can fly right through downtown Miami at night, which is one of my favorite flights to do. So we did end up doing that, and then the next morning we left early in the morning, blue sky, smooth sailing all the way up to Atlanta, and we flew right into the back end of Hurricane Fred, which I had thought maybe it would be pretty bad, pretty bumpy, but it was really smooth. I did have to take an ILS all the way down to minimums at the airport, and if this isn't a sign, I don't know what is, but right when I broke out of the ceiling, there was a fox that ran out onto the runway and looked at us and then kept running. So maybe that was, Kitfox's sign saying, hey, why are you in Atlanta? You should be finishing your plane. So that was a fun trip. Then after that, within 12 hours of me getting back, I had a whole shenanigans getting fuel, which I'm not gonna go through, but I ended up making it back pretty late that night when we got back from Atlanta, and then the next day I went to Alaska, and I was out in the bush for 9 days doing a drill program. So I was working with a company that I've worked for in the past, doing sort of some contract geology work. We were drilling with a rotary air blast. It's called a rab drill in the middle of nowhere, just northwest of Chicken. I don't know if anybody's been up there. It was really awesome because it was moose season up in that northern section of Alaska, so there were bush planes everywhere. And one of the things that was really nice for me to see is how beat up these cubs are. And you don't really appreciate that until you've gone through the process of building a plane yourself, and you've gone through the effort of covering things nicely. But you go and look at these bush planes that they use for hauling moose and caribou out in the bush, and they are just like flying garbage cans. They're just like duct tape everywhere, and they're just totally beat up. So it just sort of sets the bar pretty low for aesthetics on these bush aircraft, and definitely some really sweet planes. I don't have 36-inch tires, which they all do, and they run them down at like 2 PSI, but it was really cool to see all those guys out there going out every day. And then, of course, when we got up to Chicken, we were out on this road in the middle of nowhere, and this guy comes in with a 4-place Cub and lands just like right on the road next to us, and then turns around and takes off. He was like bringing gear out to one of their crews or one of the moose people. But yeah, it was a fun trip. Definitely was difficult. Did a lot of backcountry hauling. No helicopters this trip, so mostly all ground moves, which added an element of challenge, but I had a fun time out there. On my way back from Alaska, I stopped in Anchorage. So I went through Fairbanks down to Anchorage, saw an old friend of mine, and then ended up making the trip up to Palmer to go see Lauren and see his plane, which, of course, Lauren and I have been communicating for years, like for a year and a half now. I never actually met him, so it was great to actually sit there with him, talk to him about building the plane, and we did get a chance to take his plane out and fly it up the Knik River, up to the glaciers, which was, it's really cool. I don't really know how to describe the feeling of seeing like something go from nothing, there's just a kit, all the way to a flyable aircraft, and talking with Lauren and sort of being there, physically present with his plane and seeing, I basically been watching his build from the beginning, and sort of we've been building things together. So it was a really, it was an honor to see a completed aircraft and be able to go out and fly in something that Lauren actually built with his own hands. So thanks, Lauren, for taking me out. Super exciting experience. I hope next year I'll be able to bring this. I told him next year I'm going to be bringing this up, and we'll go out and do some flight of twos out into the boonies. Then let's see. Last thing after that is I just went back to Anchorage and made it back to Florida, and I've been trying to catch up on work. And I just got in here this weekend to sort of diagnose the remaining work that needs to be done for this thing. And I talked about that, but there's not a whole lot left. Definitely at least a weekend of work to try and catch everything up and get this thing in the air. So that's why I'm a little bit behind, because I did these trips. I'm happy I did them, and we'll be back on track here now that I've caught back up. That's it for today. I know this is a lot to cover in a video, but this is what happens when you go months at a time without doing an update. We're gonna try and stay on top of these updates more frequently now, but as I've said in the past, it's a lot of work to film and edit these things, so they come out as they come out. The last things that need to be done prior to actually flying this thing, I actually have a list right here on this note card. It's a single note card, two-sided, of the remaining tasks that need to be completed, and it is inclusive. So the things that are left are fairings. It's an aesthetic piece. You need to cover basically the gap between the windshield and the wing, so it's airtight or watertight. Turtle deck strakes, which go on the side of the turtle deck, same thing. It's designed to run off water, so those have to be mounted in place. I have to put the turtle deck hinge on, which I was debating putting on, but I've decided I'm actually gonna do that now for a variety of reasons, which I will discuss, or I have discussed. I need to do some silicone sealer on, basically watertight some stuff, put my data plate on, seal the firewall, seat belts, final calibration on the G3X, set the prop pitch. I have to do my final inspection as myself, go through and check bolts and torques and things like that, schedule and do my final FAA inspection, as well as weight and balance, and that happens prior to the final inspection, but I have to do weight and balance. So it's a pretty short list of things that need to be done, and I'm gonna try and hammer that out in the next week or so just to get this thing done. I am also moving this to the airport probably this week. Now that I have my tow transport kit put together and I feel good about moving it, I'm gonna put it on the back of the gooseneck and haul it down to the Bartow Airport, and that'll be where the remainder of the prep and inspections go from there. So that's all that's remaining. I'm not gonna put a time estimate on that because I always shoot myself in the foot because I never quite get it done exactly what I think, but we're getting close. A couple more weeks and the inspection, I'm gonna try and schedule my inspection 2 weeks from now so that we should be able to fly 2 weeks from now. So thanks for watching. Sorry again, this was late and long, but I hope you enjoyed the video, and next time, maybe we get it up in the air, who knows. Thanks for watching. This is 7 Kilo Fox. Talk to you later.